in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 18. I know it said chapter 4, but we're actually in chapter 3 and verse 18. We've got to finish 3 because I can't take 3 weeks on the same chapter. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man, or to the children of Adam, that God is testing them, that they must see that they themselves are but beasts. And so what he's trying to get people to see is that mankind is in some ways more like the animal than he is like God. Now, this is not in reference to what we see in our world today. For example, we are told that, in the taxonomic nomenclature of science discovery, that man is just another animal. But what that means is that we're just like the goat and the dog and the chimpanzee and all these other animals. We're looking at the classifications, kingdom, phi, the plant, all those. We're going up the chart, and here we are at the pinnacle of the taxonomic divisions, and yet we are just another animal. And what does that do to us as a society? What it brings us down, Tim? Makes you like Rover. When you die, you're dead all over. Read. Lets you operate by instinct and whatever you want to do. Exactly. If I'm no different than the animals, then I just act like the animals, right? Now, are there similarities, though, between... well, of course there are. God has chosen a way to create animals and animal life, and a way to create man and human life. And as we look at those aspects, there are a lot of similarities, but we're not just the same. And the one thing that separates man from animal is what? His soul. He has a soul. Now, we can talk about higher reasoning skills and more highly developed brain and all of that, but really the thing that separates us is the soul, the spirit of man that is eternal. And the animal simply doesn't have that immortal nature to him. And so when Solomon comes to this point and he says that I see that they themselves are but beasts, they are just like the animals, or they're similar to the animals. He's viewing this as God is sort of testing us, showing us that we cannot make it on our own, that not on our own wisdom, not on our own effort, not on our own merit. We're just beasts or animals under the sun. We're not really different than the animals. Again, that under the sun mentality, which dominates throughout the conversation of Ecclesiastes. There are more similarities between us and the dog than us and God, because God lives a certain way and the animal lives a certain way, or the dog lives a certain way. And where are we on that scale? If you have God on one side and animals on the other side, it's almost like a sliding scale. But who do we tend to be more like? More like the animals, right? Too often than not, if life is only considered from under the sun, that becomes dominant to us, because we're not considering who God is, what God is, so we share more things in common. Look, the whole classification system in science is based upon there is nothing beyond the natural. This is all there is. And so everything must be observed from the perspective of what we see. And the closest thing to us is the hairy ape, while we're just the naked ape, right? That's our closest living similarity. So after what he says in 16, he makes 2 comments. He said, I said in my heart. The first one he said in his heart was about God's ultimate judgment. The second one is about man left to himself. When man is left to himself, we are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beast, for all is vanity. Death isn't just an equalizer between people, but also between all life under the sun. Notice Psalm 49:12, and also in verse 20, it says, man in his pomp will not remain. He is like the beast that perishes. Man in his pomp, yet without understanding, is like the beast that perishes. You see, we still die. When our favorite cat or our favorite dog dies, it breaks our heart because we know that was a life, not an immortal life, but a life, a companion. It brought joy to our families and to ourselves. And so when they pass away, we lament. And what Solomon is saying is just like they die, we die. And while we're alive, we breathe the same air, right? We eat similar foods or foods that come from the same places, right? We grow grains. Some animals eat those grains. Then we eat those animals. Sometimes we eat those grains. If we're really healthy, we'll eat kale. But all of these things are out there that we eat, and we share those in common. We breathe the same air. We eat much the same foods, but all go to one place. All are from the dust, and to the dust shall all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes downward or down into the earth? From dust to dust, right? That's most funerals that you see in movies and on television, they always make that line: ashes to ashes and dust to dust. From dust to dust, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Genesis chapter 3. When we analyze the composition of the body, I don't know if you've ever read articles where there's so much carbon and so much potassium and so much sodium and all these different elements that make up the body, and we're worth about $1.50 in component parts, right? We're common everyday elements. Do you know what makes up the animals? The same common everyday elements. We have the same compositions. We have the same, we breathe the same air. We eat the same foods. We have a lot of similarities with the animals. Rochelle? Right. We call them diseases, I guess, because life is not as easy with these. It makes our ease of life harder. It's dis-ease. But what are they? What are diseases? Huh? How is it the result of sin? When man was cast from the Garden of Eden, he was separated from eternal life. And these things that we call diseases are the natural part of every life. You may not get every disease, and the disease you get may not be the one that kills someone else, but they are purposefully there for us to face because life is not eternal on this earth. This is how death entered into the world. And it's not because man has committed so many sins, therefore disease has entered into the world. It's because one man committed one sin in the Garden of Eden. That's it. And sometimes we say, well, his lifestyle is so wicked, it's that's brought his diseases on him. It's possible that the consequences of our lifestyle do that. But disease entered the world because one man cut off life on this earth, Adam, through his sin. And as a result, this world is against us. I know we've said that before. This is a hostile environment. If this environment of this earth were not hostile, we would live forever. But it is a hostile environment by design after the fall. Not before the fall. Before the fall, it was paradise. It was Eden, right? Now it is not. And so we have to accept that, these diseases. So yeah, disease is there. Tony, did you have a comment? Absolutely. Our consequences bring, our choices bring certain consequences. Some good. A lot of times our choices are not good, and so the consequences most often are not good either. Verse 21 reveals the distinction, the vital distinction between the beast and the man. All of these similarities, right? But then what's the distinction that he draws? Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? Man is going to face God. God is always depicted as being higher. We realize it's not locative, that there's not really a place that we can get so high that we actually reach God. That was the Tower of Babel, right? Let's build a tower until we can reach God. But it is more of, his quality is of a higher essence. And so his dwelling place is of a higher plane. And so we will see God. So knowing that man is going to see God, what should you do? Man cannot recognize the difference between man and animal. When left to himself, you can't say, well, look, here's God. He is great. He's amazing, and we are created in His image. And here's animals over here. They are created as a resource for mankind, and we use those resources, right, to better our life. That's what resources were created for. And so we use those resources. We recognize that difference now. But we can't see that difference and then say, you know what, though? I'm going to live like the animal. We can't live like the animal when we recognize there is this distinction. Yet too often we do. In Jude, in verse 10, but these people blaspheme all that they do not know or do not understand, and they are destroyed by all that they, like unreasoning animals, understand instinctively. We looked at that a few months back when we were studying through the book of Jude. But Jude recognizes that man, even though he recognizes there is a God and there is a heaven and there's something more beyond the here and now, beyond the sun, he turns around and he lives as if it's all under the sun and that's all we have to worry about. I think that's exactly what Solomon is lamenting here in Ecclesiastes. Man is different. Go ahead, Frank. No, it doesn't say soul. Right. Right. The spirit is the animating force of the flesh. And so, now man's spirit is immortal. A dog's spirit is not immortal. We might be, questioning, here he says, the ESV puts it as a question, who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward? The better translation would be, who knows the spirit of man which goes upward and the spirit of the beast which goes downward into the earth. The earth, remember what's returning to the earth? Huh? The dust, the flesh, the body, right. And he's saying that the spirit of the dog is returning there with it, meaning it is not immortal. But the spirit of man goes upward. It leaves this earth. And so it is something that we would say is eternal. So I saw that there is nothing better than man, or that a man should rejoice in his work, for this is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? In other words, enjoy life now. Do not be distracted by the injustices of life. Remember, that was kind of he's starting this discussion on the problems of life with God when we do understand God. Don't get distracted by injustice. God will take care of that too. If God is sovereign, and this is from Michael Eaton, I like this quote. If God is sovereign in his disposal of earthly events, chapter 3, verses 1 through 15, and has a purpose even in allowing human injustices, chapter 3, verses 16 through 20, and holds our ultimate destiny in his hand, in verse 21, then the attitude of the wise should be joyful confidence in the pursuit of earthly responsibilities and the pleasures they bring. Enjoy what we have here on earth instead of lamenting and wringing our hands over all the inequity and injustices of life. It's not like don't be concerned about that. Obviously we do need to be concerned about it, but our confidence and our joy is not when injustices are rectified. Our joy comes in God and knowing that he holds all of our destinies in his hand. Dale? Absolutely.
To be like him. We don't have to be like the animals in this earth. We can be like God.
And
because that's what he created us to be. So it's our choice to not flounder around like an animal. We are over the animals on this earth.
right.
We are where we're supposed to be with God.
And that's why it is so important that we as Christians live as Christians, that we as Christians we are the ambassadors of God to our communities and our society. And if we are not speaking God's truth, we will never be able to countermand the education systems, the television shows, the documentaries that are telling us you're just animals, you're just animals, you're just animals. Man is an animal, man is an animal. And we get that as such a constant mantra of society right now that it's hard for people to look past the here and now and say, how I ought to behave is so that I get to heaven. Rather, how I ought to behave is what is in my best interest. Andrew first here. It's a good point. Yeah. Does the lion feel remorse when he takes out the wildebeest? No. No. Art? Yes, and what's interesting is in the Hebrew the word is ruah, and it's translated as breath. It's translated as spirit. It's what's used, for example, in Genesis 2 and verse 7 when God breathed into the nostrils the breath of life. You could say, we could translate it. God spirited it into his nostrils, the spirit of life, and so that becomes the animating force. Well, then if we take that idea of spirit as being the animating force, the giving of life, and now we talk about the Spirit of God, what is he doing? He's breathing into us this newness of life. And so there is a connection between them, this idea of the divine Spirit entering to us, the regeneration that he gives us in Titus 3, verses 5 through 7, that what was initially the physical life is now this spiritual life because of its connection to God's Spirit. And yes, and that kind of goes back to the, he's put eternity in our hearts. There is something innate about us, something intrinsic within us that says there is more. There is more, and our hearts long for it. We live for it. We jealously seek it because we want that. We may be happy with life here, but no matter how happy we are with life here, there is still something that is calling us to something higher. And that's the eternity in our heart. That's the zeal for the Spirit. Okay, if the first issue of problem with life with God is that there's still injustice in the world, he's now going to take up the second one here in chapter 4. The problem is that part of life is there's oppression. Not only is there injustice, there is oppression. Again, I saw. Now notice he keeps, he says, for example, at the beginning of the first one, I saw, and then the conclusions, I said, and that's what I saw. And now he's going to go over again. He says, I saw, I looked, I saw, I observed. This is what I'm seeing. I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. There isn't just inequality in the world. There is this overt oppression that we see. Power is on the side of the oppressor because, think about it, as the oppressor gains strength, he's gaining his power, right? And he's pushing people down. He's pushing them down. He's stepping on him. And those who eventually seek to reform the oppression, they have to accumulate their own power, right? And then they overthrow the oppressor, and then what happens? They become the oppressor, right? That never happens in our world, does it? It happens all the time. Those who seek to reform the oppression often gain enough power and then become the oppressors. And the oppressed then are left without a comforter. Did Jesus have this in mind when he promised to them in John 14, I will send a comforter to you? This yearning of the Spirit, this jealous desire of the Spirit, because it comforts us. We gain advantage when we have the Holy Spirit. We gain a comfort. History is full of oppressors like Stalin and Hitler and Mao and Hussein, and we could go on with the list. People love power. And where there is no resting morality, the quest for power often corrupts. It turns into the Holocaust or the Holodomor or the Rwandan genocide or whatever we want to go back in history and talk about. God gave mankind free will, but that means that man can choose the wicked path. And history shows that we do. Mankind too often chooses that bad, wicked, evil way. Solomon says, I see it. I'm just as bothered by it as you are. I see it. So what do? I thought of the dead who are already dead, that they are more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been born and has not seen evil deeds that are done under the sun. Perhaps the saddest observation under the sun is that the value of those who are not witnessing the oppression on the earth are better off. The dead, the unborn, later he'll talk about the stillborn. They're better off because they don't come into this world where they witness the injustice and the oppression. They don't see the inequities of life that we see and that we struggle with. And here, more frustration is built within us when looking at the world. Remember, that's the whole purpose of the book of Ecclesiastes, is to create tension and conflict and frustration between us and the world. Because what does that conflict and frustration lead us to? Right, it leads us to a higher calling. When we're frustrated with our situation, don't we look for a better situation? And when we look at the situation of the earth, look, it's I think that's one reason why people want to go to Mars. It's like, hey, we can get to Mars, we can rebuild it, make it better than the earth. No, we can't, because the people rebuilding it are the same ones that destroyed this planet. The inequities and the injustice will go with us wherever human beings are. And so we become frustrated with this life. And it just deepens our longing for the next. Tim?
Well, if your only focus, only lens you're using is human wisdom, what is there to see? If you don't have the Holy Spirit and God's will to put a fine tune on that focus, you're like Rover. I mean, might as well do whatever I want to do.
Yeah.
It's a bad, like Solomon said, it's vanity. If all there is what I see right now, I'm sorry.
That's it. Jennifer?
What's another sad point is that it's no wonder that we have so many, especially young people and older people, so many people committing suicide because they see something, they don't see anything more. There is no hope, there is no purpose.
Right. We've told them there's nothing higher than this. And they're looking at the oppression, they're looking at the injustice, and they're saying, this is the best there is? And no one loves me? No one thinks to ask how I'm doing? When we rob one another of friendship, and in fact, that's where he's going in this next part, is that when we rob ourselves of companionship and relationship, or we hurt one another through our relationships, and we tell them it doesn't get any better than this, is there any wonder that we have an epidemic of suicide? And the deal is that's not worldwide. Do you know why? Because in a lot of other parts of the world, even though they may follow false gods, they still believe in something higher than themselves. There's still a hope that it's not filling that God-shaped hole. There's a couple arms broke off, but they're trying to put something higher and more valuable in that hole. But not in our society. We've jerked God out of the picture, and what we're trying to put in has nothing to do with a higher plane or a better existence or something more valuable. It's all just this same nothingness, emptiness. And you can't fill that hole with that. There is a difference. Then I saw that all the toil and all the skill in the work comes from a man's envy of his own neighbor. This also is a vanity and a striving after the wind. He shifts from injustice to oppression and now to greed or miserliness. Life can be a rat race where everyone is running around looking for the cheese. Life becomes more about the reward and less about the experience. In the 1950s, every family was looking to make the next move up the ladder. Bigger homes, nicer cars, better clothes, fancier clothes. Those became the measurements of the good life, the American dream, we often refer to it. We're going to go get a little better and get a little better and get a little better. Well, the next generation grew tired of that rat race. They didn't want to follow into those same places, and they often checked out. They eschewed ambition, financial success. They sat in flower fields, meditated, hummed, grew long hair, and refused to bathe. Their parents didn't know what to make of it, and they decided the experience was better than the reward. Terry? No, I think it's because we have more information to report how bad it is now. I think a lot of the crimes that are going on now have been going on for millennia. But they didn't have Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and 24-hour news channels and everyone with a camera and on their phone. We're seeing more of it, and we're seeing things that used to be hidden better are now right in front of us, and it just makes things look worse. Dale?
It goes all the way back, and all the way back into the beginning of the Bible, everywhere. People without God was misery, was evil, was death, was killing, God wiped everybody out, but Noah. So it was then.
Yeah.
You don't think that they weren't as bad as it is now?
Every thought of his...
Every thought was evil.
Yeah. In fact, it's a superlative. Every thought of his heart was only evil continually. I mean, that's bad, and that was in Noah's day. So mankind comes up with wicked things to do to one another. There's no doubt about it, Terry. I mean, and it is terrible. But if there's no morality governing man's inventions, then that's where we go. Yeah.
You're either following God or you're following the devil. Even if you're a good person, one or the other. There is no in between, and that's the fight is between God and Satan for us.
Right, over our souls. Right. Which, listen, when you fight against someone, there's usually a prize in the middle that you're fighting over. Whether it's a competition or, it's, it might be a barroom brawl, not that you go to bar rooms, but, the fights that happen there, there's something in the middle that they're fighting over. God is fighting for us. He prizes us that much that he's willing to get into this cosmic battle. Althea. Sorry. Yes, I saw you doing that. Like we're seeing our sin so up close now that we're revolted by what we can do. And we're saying, you know what, maybe it's time to turn around and go the other. And I hope you're right. I want that to be right. Look, the nation is not going to be ever. I mean, nations themselves cannot be Christians. How do you baptize a nation? That type deal. I mean, but what we can do is follow godly principles. And the closer we follow those, the stronger a nation's going to be because God created us that way. So here's this picture he has of the man who is toiling. We would often say, he's a workaholic. He works and he works and he works because he wants to be better than everyone else. He wants to have more than anyone else. He seems to agree that money and advancement for the sake of themselves is pointless. Keeping up with the Joneses is vanity because it cannot bring lasting happiness. And rivalry and envy are useless and ugly. What happens to the miser who swims in his vaults of gold coin like Scrooge McDuck? He's alone. That's exactly right. He is alone. And so he goes right into the other extreme. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. If you checked out in the 60s and said, you know what? I'm getting away from the rat race. I'm going to be better than all that. I'm going to go sit in the poppy fields. And that's going to be my life. Then he says, but the fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Once we are aware of the vanity of financial pursuits, we may be tempted to join those hippies, but the preacher warns that laziness and idleness are just as worthless. They lead to self-consumption. Naomi?
I was thinking about how class started with how we're like being. I started thinking, well, what does an animal do? An animal's selfish. They only care about themselves. They will kill other of their species to eat, to survive. And that's when we take God out of our lives and we put us in, and we put our selfishness in place of Him. That's what all of this boils down to. Being envious of others because we don't see a bigger picture or
Self-preservation. And and that's his whole point. This is where it's leading us when we have no higher hope. This is it. And he says, look, we're trying to find meaning in life. Well, I'm going to work like a dog until I get the best house and the best cars and the best clothes and the most money, and then I will win. We're trying to put something in that hole, that God-shaped hole, and it's money. It's not going to work. And then someone's more altruistic. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to enjoy the experience. We're going to fold our hands in idleness. And he says that's not it. He comes to this conclusion. He says, better is a handful of quietness. So here's the two extremes, laziness and we'll have to stop here. But overwork, he says, that's not it. The better is the handful of quietness than two handfuls of toiling and striving after the wind. In other words, work for what you do need, but then turn around and enjoy it and build those relationships. That's what's going to be important. We'll pick up in verse 6 next week. Appreciate your attention.